So how did things slowly begin to change? Through the Enlightenment. The discovery of science and the acceptance of science showed that much of what people attributed to supernatural happenings were not supernatural at all. In addition, the Enlightenment ushered in the focus on the self, and that there was a self, that people could know and determine their own destinies. For example, Immanuel Kant said, "Dare to know, have the courage to use your own intelligence." And he meant, don't rely on the priest to tell you what you should know, and find out for yourself. One of the things that he was rallying against there was the idea that back then in the Catholic Church, they discouraged people from reading scripture at all because the priest was needed to interpret it for them. So he said, dare to know, have the courage to use your own intelligence. So if that was true and people could determine their own destinies, then they could also determine what the best kind of government would be to rule the people, right? And the idea of a social contract sprang from the Enlightenment, that we all agree to this idea of consequences for our actions for breaking laws, and that we agree that certain people are going to represent us in the government, and we can even decide what kind of government would be best. That government isn't necessarily handed down by God, and that the people who lead the government are just people, and they're not God's hand working on earth. And if people determine their own destiny, then they could also determine what is right and wrong. They determine morality instead of morality being dictated to them. And if they if they were able to determine what was moral, well, how should they go about it? One person who offered us a way to go about deciding what was moral is Adam Smith. Adam Smith is usually better known as the father of capitalism. He wrote the book, The Wealth of Nations, and said that markets should be free to run themselves, and that without government interference. Now you think of the father of capitalism and you might think of somebody who doesn't care that much about people. But nothing is further from the truth. The same person who is the father of capitalism, the very first words in his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, says, "How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it." And that's really true. Now, I'm not going to read this whole thing. You can go ahead and dwell on this slide and read through this little selection on Adam Smith, but this is the idea that it is empathy and compassion that drives our moral sentiments, and that when we see someone in pain, the idea that when we see someone in pain, that we want to relieve it, and that something in us feels that pain that other person feels, and so we don't want to make him or her suffer anymore. And that's essentially the foundation of his moral law, in essence, is through our imaginations, we exercise the golden rule, really to do unto others what we would want others to do to us, but it's through imagining what that other people is feeling that other people are feeling, that we decide what is right for them. So why did Adam Smith give credence to those he saw suffering? A lot of the ones that he mentions just in that little part that I quoted in the previous slide, they're people getting in trouble. And really, they're people getting in trouble who were probably guilty. But I like to think, I have no basis for this in reality, but I like to think that maybe he just got sick of seeing it. Maybe he just got tired of the suffering, and even though in a way it's kind of selfish because he got tired maybe of how it felt within him when he saw someone broken on the wheel. But suffice it to say that this idea of the Enlightenment took hold, and that people no longer thought of themselves as subject to the king and queen, as the king and queen of arms of God, and that no matter what the king or queen said or did, it was always right. I think in our political system, it's pretty much guaranteed that hardly anybody agrees with the political leader, whoever he or she is. But I like the idea that we have sympathy and compassion, and that we are allowed to exercise it. I think back then, in the times that you are reading about right now, that people had sympathy and compassion, but they weren't allowed to express it, and maybe didn't feel it as strongly as someone who is not used to seeing those things on the street. When you start reading about the American Revolution and people being tarred and feathered, people would die from being tarred and feathered. And I like it today that when we don't see sympathy and compassion and empathy, we complain. And look at the rants and raves section of the Peninsula Daily News. I used to think that that was the biggest waste of space in the newspaper, and in addition, comic relief. But if you really look in there, the raves are all about people who have sympathy and compassion by buying a meal for someone else or finding a wallet and not taking the money out of it. And a lot of the rants are about people who are cruel to one another, or they don't take others' needs into consideration. But all in all, just keep in mind that you too are a product of your culture. We may have a very different way of seeing things, but our way of seeing things is shaped by our parents, by our culture, by our time in history. What we think is right and wrong is equally shaped by our time in history and our culture and the books that we believe in. We may be like the colonists and the early Americans, and we may not. In some ways we are, in some ways we're not. So just keep that in mind as you read the literature, and see if you can pick up any clues about what sort of ways their culture influences them, and how you are both the same and different from them. See you later. Hope this was okay. Bye.